Okay, now we're going to talk about Rousseau. Okay, Rousseau. This is keeping going with my notes that are posted, that are posted, that are posted here. Okay, Enlightenment notes. Okay, go here. Okay. Um, of course, a man of the Enlightenment, but went beyond the Enlightenment. He believed in the power of reason, and he was different from other philosophers at the start. He grew up poor, not privileged in any way. He was always at the disposal of more sophisticated women in his life, meaning that he was his patrons were usually women, and he usually slept with those women. They were usually older women, so he always kind of had this weird power dynamic with older women. He was abandoned by his mom and his dad very young. So if you take kind of Freudian analysis and kind of apply it to Rousseau, he might have always been searching for his lost mother in a way, and kind of if you can analyze his ideas through that lens. He searched for truth obsessively, truth about man and society and about himself, right? One of his main works, one of the things that made him so distinctive was that he talked about his emotions, and he talked about his sex life, and he talked about his desires and his feelings. Confessions, 1782, appears 4 years after he dies. What I have promised to relate is the history of my soul. How romantic. He's expressing this feeling. Confessions becomes a bestseller. It's a standard reading for generations into the 19th century. It's his autobiography. It starts people and philosophers an outpouring of feelings in imitation of Rousseau. So it starts a new genre, the revelations of one's soul in public and to one's friends. He jumpstarts the Romanticism and Sturm und Drang, the German movement of this passionate, expressive emotion. You're going to have to look that up. Sturm und Drang. We'll go over that when we get to the 19th century. So where is truth to be found for Rousseau? In the genuine. Anything that is genuine. His definition of this inspires the reaction against the Enlightenment, interestingly. Genuine is anything which is closest to human nature, the least intellectualized, anything not artificial, right? He even kind of goes after Voltaire for having an artificial name. Voltaire is not Voltaire's name. His name is really something else, but he says it's an artificial name. So Confessions is genuine, a worship of nature. So what does he mean by that? He says he loved burying and losing himself in the forest. In the forest, he can expose the lies of mankind. He can use his reason to explain how man has perverted nature and created false hierarchies, false worldviews. It might seem like he exalts the primitive in this way, but nature is genuine only in contrast to what man has made of himself. Nature is the foil to man. It brings out his lies and deceptions. Does this lead to the worship of nature and innocence? Well, he says, I can see how the inhabitants of cities, who see nothing but walled streets and crimes, have so little religious belief. The Confessions is hugely influential in this way, right? He's kind of saying that man is losing the sense of himself. As Nietzsche will say later, that truths are no longer truths, and we've been kidding ourselves if we think that we know truth, okay? Because we're so removed from nature, we're so removed from the natural world and from our own nature. People began, because of Confessions, to worship a kind of primitivism. Now, this is in the late Enlightenment period, right? So they're worshiping a kind of primitivism, praise of primitive rural life, revival of folklore and the village. Even Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the monarchs that are brought down in the French Revolution, build a village behind Versailles, right, to kind of simulate what it's like to live in the village again. It's interesting. Remember, Rousseau said that the existing social order had created men who are totally dependent, that primitive man was never dependent on anyone but himself. Man is only man in society, he says, meaning that man has created this idea of what he's supposed to be. This means that Rousseau knows that he can't stay in the forest, he has to return to the world, so therefore society has to be reformed. He says society has become unnatural, we have to remake society into something more natural, more genuine, so therefore the hierarchy of lords, monarchy, land, hunting privileges, for example, hunting, you had to be a noble to hunt, you could only hunt on no, commoners couldn't hunt, right? You had to have special privileges to hunt This is unnatural. This is artificial. As he says, the justice and uselessness of my complaints left in my mind the seeds of indignation against our foolish civil institutions, whereby the real welfare of the public and true justice are always sacrificed to an apparent order, which is in reality subversive of all order, meaning natural order, and of which the only effect is to bestow the sanctions of public authority upon the oppression of the weak and the injustices of the strong. So he's against false order. He's against the false order of the time, meaning the hierarchy. He feels like the absolutism and the aristocracy, it's an abuse of man's potential and ability. People are left out in the cold, people who can make a difference, people who have merit and talent. Therefore, Rousseau is against this perverted order. That's what he means when he says man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains, right? He said it's society that has become unnatural. It is society that has become unnatural. So he says in Confessions that he bases the goodness of man. He actually believes in that man has natural goodness. He bases this goodness on man's passions, on man's ability to follow his heart. Okay, because science is saying that we should reduce passions, but you have to follow your heart. So the big point being that the totality of man is heart with reason, right? You have to balance passion with reason. By the time he finishes Confessions before he dies, this is evidence that he has become disenchanted with the philosophes. Okay, so this is very different from the social contract. He says that they had rent asunder, meaning totally divided reason and passion. And he says that reason should not be about dogma and system. Reason is man's conscience. It's a part of totality of man. So if you only use reason, and Kant says the same thing, right? Immanuel Kant says the same thing. If you only use reason removed from passion, it becomes a system that can be corrupted. You can reason anything. You can reason slavery. You can reason racism. You can reason the Holocaust. Science and reason can be corrupted. So then let's go back to Emile, his novel, right, where he says conscience is to the soul what instincts are to the body. So the body cannot live without instincts. The soul cannot live without conscience. This is where we have to balance reason and emotion. This is where Kant comes in. All this assumed the perfectibility of man, okay, one of those Enlightenment concepts. Using reason to balance passion, this is the ultimate goal. This comes through in the social contract. In fact, even if the social contract is less emotional and more based on politics, okay? So you can actually see it start there. The social contract was written for the city-state of Geneva, where he was from. All men govern each other by social consent. That's what he means. So we know how this social contract is different from Locke and Hobbes. The government by the general will. Okay, this is where I want to bring in the general will and why this is important. Common consent of all, people with people, not people with a separate government. That this general will needs to be popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty, what does that mean? If we are optimistic about man's ability to control passions through reason, to use both, he contrasts with his pessimism about his existing society. He says that the concept of the people will, for the first time, be a part of the discussion. Okay, the people become a theoretical entity. Okay, we are now at a point where Europeans become optimistic about the masses, way more optimistic than Voltaire or Montesquieu. So he's not elitist, he's a Democrat, but he advocates a break with the present, but not through revolution, with reform, okay? He says that we must reform this false order and provide a genuine order over this false order, right? A false order is anything given by the past, okay? So the general will must be expressed, right? The majority opinion must be expressed. So in his world, the majority is the peasants and the bourgeoisie over the aristocracy and the clergy and the king. Okay, so here's another way that rituals and festivals come in to kind of say, how are we going to express the bourgeoisie? We need rituals and festivals. We need festivals to be in the open air, to commune with nature, to create bonds with our fellow man. And the festivals and rituals in nature will make people happy, that allow men and women to rejuvenate their virtues, right? They must rejuvenate themselves through nature. So if you have a direct democracy and the ideal state will be based on the people. Then festivals will make people love the state and love collectivity and allow the general will to be expressed in a direct democracy. So the festivals will provide symbolism. That direct democracy will be demonstrated in festivals. This will be co-opted by Robespierre in the French Revolution. He won't be the only one to figure out that you will need rituals and symbols to lead a mass movement, right? So the idea that we need rituals and symbols and festivals to express the general will, this is taking the place of Christianity. This is taking the place of the Christian liturgy. It's being replaced. If the general will is expressed in a secular way, the general will being expressed in a secular way. The problem is that the manipulation of mass movements and social control will lead to nationalism and will lead to violent nationalism, and this is why Rousseau is blaming for totalitarianism. But still, he founded the concept of the people and the concept of modern politics, meaning modern politics is politics of mass movements, right? What counts in the end is our rituals and festivals. Like, what do we see today with Trump and people going to his rallies, right? I mean, these are mass movements. These are festivals in a way, right? There's music, there's eating, there's dancing. So back to Rousseau's other works for a second. Let's see. Okay, let's go to Emile for a second. The Romantics read Confessions and Emile, but not necessarily the social contract. Let's go to Emile. The main character, Emile, is exposed only to nature as a child. He's educated first in nature, sent out to take walks in the woods. He develops virtues to withstand later corruption that he goes into when he gets into society. So he avoids corrupt education in a corrupt society. Then he goes to school. So he is educated. Emile is educated by nature in an untainted and uncorrupted way. The next generation in Europe will pick up on this and be opposed to the Enlightenment and rationalism and systems in part because of Rousseau. Let's get back to these ideas of the virtue of the masses, the mass movement and mass people. Okay, Rousseau, the idea of the virtue of the masses will revive not in the Romantic movement, not with Robespierre during the French Revolution and the Republic of Virtue, meaning what Robespierre sets up in the French Revolution, but it will be revived with Marxism. And sorry that I've been not changing images. Marx says that the mass of men are redeemable. Marx will be the father of communism, right? The father of Mother Russia, the father of socialism. Under the right treatment, they can rule themselves in the general will. Marx is all about the general will. He predicts that after a proletarian revolution, meaning a working class revolution, there will be a consensus of virtue, because unalienated man will recapture his human freedom, his human nature. This all uses the idea of Rousseau's the general will. So all mass movements embrace this concept. The liturgy of modern politics transfer meaning of religion to politics. So this is the big takeaway here. Festivals are mass meetings, right? Festivals, that's what we mean by mass meetings. The idea of the people has been raised. Popular sovereignty and festivals grow up in one man's mind thanks to Rousseau. To get around this problem, that somehow you have to objectify to make real to people a general collectivity which is inherently abstracted, make it real through the goddess of reason or through the ideal Aryan type, right? The idea is that rituals, symbols, and festivals are a civic religion. You want to build a civic religion. The nation, the idea of a nation, an imagined community, as Benedict Anderson, the historian, has said, the nation is an imagined community. So where if you have rituals and symbols and festivals that are directed to a government, a nation, then you have civic religion, and civic religion is a religion that replaces spiritual religion, perhaps. So does nationalism displace Christianity? Is nationalism that's something that people believe so fervently as they once did in religion? Okay? So from now on, Europeans have two different types of doctrines, like the doctrine of Christianity and the doctrine of mass politics. Sometimes they mesh. Sometimes they're based on the familiar and traditional literacy of Christianity. Sometimes politics becomes mass manipulation. So how do you sway the masses? How do you find the correct myths and match myths to symbols? Right? They did it. The Nazis did it. The idea of mass politics itself is evidence of changing social structure, the dynamic of economic and social movements. The philosophes, right, led very comfortable lives, but they ended up having these ideas that basically said, okay, we need to, if we're going to reject all a priori knowledge, right, then, if we're going to express the general will, if we're going to break down society and get away from the aristocracy, then unfortunately this is going to be a result, okay?